Hey, good evening, everyone. We are excited to have you here and have you join this conversation. Just a quick word before we begin. This is going to be the first of a few, 2 to 3 conversations on Black mental health, and more specifically, the mental health in the Black community when it comes to males. Um, right before we begin, I want to say a few words, and the whole goal here at Men Mental is to be open. We believe that that is one of the first steps that anyone needs to take on their journey of getting better mentally. So, in preparing for this conversation, I've figured out that it's been incredibly it's proven itself to be incredibly hard, and I've had to battle a couple things. One, I've had to battle, I guess, the imposter syndrome, and also battle the fact that it's going to be a heavy subject to discuss, and also this conversation on mental health in the Black community, and especially when it comes to Black males, but also when we look at it through the lens of the criminal justice system. I felt the pressure to really do this conversation justice. So without any more delay, I really would like to introduce the guest that I am so excited about today. Her name is Shantia Coley, and she is an author, speaker, and an attorney. She's also a first-generation college graduate, and right after that went on to law school, served briefly as a defense attorney, as a public defender, and then is currently serving as a counsel for a Fortune 500 company. Delay, we're going to try to bring her in here for this conversation.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Sorry about the technical difficulties that we had there going at the beginning.
It happens. It happens.
Well, I really appreciate this and you taking the time out of your day. So before we start, though, there are some words that I learned about a couple days ago that I really want to say, because these words capture the essence of our discussion today. And they come from Dr. Alfie Breland Noble. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she is, I guess, part of the ACOMA project, and she is a mental health expert, especially when it comes to the Black community. So a few days ago, she wrote, I guess, an op-ed, and I just, some of these words really spoke to me. So here we go. She says, research has established that African Americans are at exponentially greater risk for health problems due to prolonged exposure to systemic racism, institutionalized discrimination, microaggressions, and chronic stress. And then she goes on after that to say that the cumulative effect of these issues creates a weathering effect on our minds and bodies, leaving us more vulnerable to disease and poor mental health well-being. So I feel like those words spoke a lot to what we are going to discuss today. And when I first introduced you as the guest, I spoke about how you were a first-generation college graduate.
Yes.
And that's going to be where we dive into in the first part of our conversation. I also want to say thanks to your mom for her service. So that was that's really amazing to see. So let's begin. What made you become involved in wellness and especially mental health? Because being a first year or a first generation college graduate, that's stressful. That's got to be stressful, and that also has to be, I can't even, for lack of better terms, like scary, right?
Absolutely terrifying. Terrifying because you're leaving the nest, you're going away for, my plan was for 4 years, right? And you don't really know who to ask for advice for when you're faced with some sort of obstacle or some sort of crossroads. I didn't have anyone in my family that I could turn to. So that's probably, looking back, college was probably my first introduction to having to be intentional about taking care of my mental health. That's the first time I recall slipping into depression. And of course, at the time, I didn't know that's what it was. But that's also when I was encouraged to seek therapy. So college was the first time that I was presented with this idea of mental wellness and taking care of self, and doing that through therapy. And of course, now, as you've mentioned, I'm a practicing attorney. I'm in my 7th year of law, but and I'm in corporate law now. Let me make that clear. I'm in corporate law now, but I began my career as a public defender. So I was in the criminal defense world, for lack of a better term, for about 4 years. And easily 90% of my clients were African-American males who had been traumatized in one way or another. And so you have first-generation college graduate, or first-generation college student and graduate, that has dealt with mental health on her own. Now I'm surrounded by Black men who are dealing with mental health issues. I'm also now married to a Black man and the mother of 2 Black boys. So there is no way that I could not prioritize mental health and wellness.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfectly said. I mean, that's really amazing to see. And then after your years in undergrad, you went on to law school. In law school, I don't know about the numbers back then, but now the numbers are still very staggering when it comes to African American people being represented in as law students. How was that experience?
Well, for me, so I went to a predominantly white undergraduate institution. So when I decided to shift my gears and go to change gears and go to law school, I was intentional about seeking out a historically Black university. So I went to a historically Black, I believe there are 5, don't quote me on that, but about 5 or 6 in the United States. I chose one of the historically Black institutions for law school. So I was surrounded by Black people. I was surrounded by persons of color and brown people. But law school it's taxing. It is emotionally draining. It probably was, or it was the hardest 3 years of my entire life. And one thing I will say that now looking back, I noticed was that, so in most law schools, women outnumber the men. That's another issue with the legal community. We don't have that many men that are represented that are actually graduating and moving on to become attorneys after law school. And at my particular law school, it was no different. The women outnumbered the men. And there was a therapist who was on campus, not on just the main campus, but on the law school campus. And I remember noticing that she was free for all of us. Somehow she was tied into our tuition, I'm sure. The women seemed to utilize her disproportionately more than the young men. And I say this because we had women's groups, and we would go to her as groups. And I imagine one-on-one, it was the same, mostly women. And the men didn't have that. And so that will take us further into our discussion there. But I know that law school is mentally draining for everyone. But I noticed that it was the women, the Black women, that were seeking out mental help more than the Black men.
And that really speaks to volume because, on a very small level, that can be brought to the macro level, right? When it comes to men seeking mental health advice or mental health counseling in society.
Yes.
And yeah.
And so, and I'll speak more on that. It's really terrifying when you think about it and when you put it into perspective, because Black men, and I know Black women as well, but for this particular conversation, Black men have been subject to extreme emotional trauma from as far back, and even before, but as far back as watching their families torn apart and taken from them at the hands of slave owners, right? To now, fast forward, they're literally watching themselves die in the media every single day. And then you bring in the criminal justice system and the trauma that exists there. And I can speak to as an attorney, I had privileged or confidential conversations with my clients who were largely in part, again, Black men. And because those clients or those conversations were confidential, I was privy to a lot of information that the normal person wouldn't be privy to, which the best way I could describe it was I was trusted with the raw emotion of Black men. And so I saw the mask come off, the mask that many Black men are walking around with today. And they wear those masks because they're taught that they can't emote. Well, I saw those. I saw the tears in my office, the yelling, the screaming, the sheer frustration. And when you add that with the fact that not only are so many men traumatized, but the fact that so few Black men actually seek therapy, it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. And I won't say therapy. Therapy is just one resource. I'll say so many Black men, so few Black men seek some sort of mental help. That's a huge issue, and it needs to be discussed. I'm so glad you're doing this work. It needs to be addressed, and it needs to be reconciled.
Yeah, I really do. I think you have a really good point there. I mean, that actually kind of gives a little preview to the conversation I'm going to have next week. Because when it comes to men seeking mental health counseling, but specifically Black men seeking mental health counseling, I can bring in my own experience of looking for that, right? And not seeing anyone that looks like me, anyone that represents, or anyone that could understand what I would go through on a daily basis. So that's a whole other issue that deserves even greater attention, why we need more representation in the mental health counseling community when it comes to providing that help to Black men, right? But first and foremost, we have to kind of seek that. We have to start being open. We have to get rid of that stigma that does exist in society. And what you talked about really kind of like allows us to segue into the next part of our conversation, because one of the main things that really adds a lot of stress and really affects our mental health as Black men negatively is the criminal justice system in the U.S. And at any point in this part, correct me if I give the wrong information or if I say something that's not accurate, since you have more hands-on experience than I do. But this morning I was thinking about it and thinking, okay, what have I experienced in my personal life that really stresses me out when it comes to like the police department or law in general? And the only example that I keep coming back to, it is an example that every Black man and every Black person has experienced in this country. That example is driving down the street and driving past a police cruiser and immediately looking in the rearview mirror. Mm-hmm. And I can't even remember how many times that has happened, right? Where I just look, when I look up in the rearview mirror and my stress levels go up a little bit. Mm-hmm. So in this part, the goal is to really like, what I would like to see is if there is a link, right, between how the criminal justice system is set up in the U.S. and how it's so prejudiced against African Americans and African American males and mental health problems in the community.
There's absolutely a link. There's a direct link, not even an indirect link. I mean, the example you just gave of literally probably having a great day, right? And then driving, seeing a police cruiser, and immediately your red flags are going up, your guard is going up. That's anxiety. That's anxiety. And I've seen the statistics. They're out there for anybody who wants to look them up. Black men in vast numbers report experiencing depression and anxiety at least daily. So putting that into perspective, every single day you're dealing with some sort of anxiety or depression. And to hear that a lot of it can come from literally just seeing a police cruiser. How many police cruisers are out there? And I'm not even getting specific. I'm not even talking about actually going through the criminal justice system, right? Actually being arrested and all of that comes with it, and having allegations and having to find a defense attorney and appearing in court. I'm not even talking about all that. I'm talking about the criminal justice system and the state of it as it is, and the fact that many Black men such as yourself can be having a wonderful day and your mental health is impacted simply by seeing a police cruiser and worrying if they're going to follow you or if you're going to die today. That's anxiety that leads to depression. So yes, there is a direct link between our system as it's set up now and the mental health issues that target our African American men.
Yeah, and I mean, I completely agree. And doing my research this week, one of the most scary links that I found when it comes to data was this. So when I looked at some data according to the Phillips Black Project, and also with I guess they worked together with the Prison Project Initiative, and what they came up with was that between 1980 and 1991, the ratio of I guess juveniles that were sentenced to life without parole was 1.64 Black juveniles to every one white juvenile. And in that same span, from 1980 to 1995, looking at information from from HHS, the suicide rate between African Americans juveniles between the age of 10 and 14 increased 233%. I mean, that data, when I came up on that, I was just like, that was, how long ago was that? That was over 20 years ago. Over 25 years ago.
And so what those numbers are now.
So exactly, right? Those numbers must be just insane now.
Exactly.
Because they would have had the time to collect the data. And you briefly touched on this before with your experiences as a public defender.
Mm-hmm.
I interned in college with a public defender. And I remember being in the courtroom and going around from client to client to client to client, right? Your experience must have been the same. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
But also, when it comes to Black males, did you see those stats being represented? Did you see a disproportionate amount of Black males in court every day? And from what you said they told you when they removed the mask, what can you disclose to us?
So did I see a disproportionate amount of Black men in the courtroom, in the criminal justice system? Yes, I did. So I was a public defender for about 3.5 years, as I stated earlier. Probably can count on my fingers and toes how many of my clients were not Black men.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, on my fingers and toes out of 4 years, almost 4 years of work. And it's staggering. And so when those masks were taken off, when they were vulnerable, and for anybody that's just joining, I described earlier, when you're an attorney, there's attorney-client privilege, right? So nothing can be repeated, no specifics, no conversations, nothing that is in public record and has to do with the allegations in the case. And your attorneys or your clients knew that, and if they didn't, that was one of the first things that we expressed to them and that we explained to them. And so after doing that, a lot of the masks for my Black men would be taken off. And what I saw was nothing short of fragility. Most of the Black men were broken. And a lot of times when those masks came off and they began talking to me and they were vulnerable with me and entrusting me with information, it had nothing to do with the case. Yeah. It had nothing to do with the case. The trauma oftentimes stemmed from childhood, from birth, from family, from the criminal justice system, from just the color of their skin. The trauma was and is deeply rooted. Was and is deeply rooted. And of course, if I would ever see those same clients out and about in the streets, when we're not in the courtroom, and oftentimes I wouldn't speak unless they spoke to me first, because, I don't want to blow anyone's cover, just like a therapist won't come up to you in public and say, hey, I represent you, how are you doing? So I would go about my business, but oftentimes they would come up and say, hi, Miss Coley, how are you? And one thing I would notice was the mask was back on, right? The masculinity was back there. And that tells me that a lot of our Black men are hiding behind a lot of trauma, behind a lot of post-traumatic stress, behind a lot of anxiety, behind a lot of depression. They don't trust anyone with it. They don't trust anyone with it. And oftentimes for good reason. Yeah.
What sort of changes would you love to see in the criminal justice system? Then changes that could really go into helping Black men when it comes to their mental health, even if, you know, in prison or incarcerated?
Oh, that's a tough one. I don't even know where to begin. Clearly changes with the police and
Mhm.
the police brutality, because a lot of times there's fear from the minute there's an arrest. A client can be arrested for a pay theft and worry that they're not even going to live, through the night in jail while they're awaiting their bond hearing. So that's where I'd begin. I would begin right where we are today. I'm encouraging people to stand behind what's going on today, not necessarily defunding or funding the police. I won't take a stance on that one publicly, but I will say just looking at the legislation and not even the legislation, the policies of police force when it comes to arrests and when it comes to the type of physicality that they can exert against someone that they're arresting, because that's the initial interaction, the arrest or the stop. And a lot of times that's where the fear initiates already, because at that point, a lot of Black men fear for their lives just from being stopped. So I would like to see a lot of policy changes around that, around the first encounter, what police officers can and cannot do. It's sad that we're having these conversations in 2020, but apparently things need to be re-examined. They do, and it's been this way for a while. And as I tell a lot of allies that I work with, this isn't new. It's just televised. It's just viral now. It's just recorded. But there need to be serious changes in the policies of these police forces when it comes to that initial arrest.
Yeah, and I mean, I couldn't agree more to what you've just said.
And not, maybe I shouldn't say initial arrest, initial stop, the initial stop, because all stops don't lead to arrest, but sometimes they are exacerbated to the point or escalated to the point of an arrest because of fear on our parts when we are stopped.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. And then going from there, we have a lot of disparities when it comes to sentencing as well. When you look at Black men versus white men and Hispanic men sandwiched in between the two, right? So those are things that must be addressed as well. And really, you said a lot of great things that lead us into our next the next part of our conversation. And one of the reasons why I reached out to you was because you were on Mental Health America, and you spoke of this great thing of controlling the noises, right? And before we go into that, it's important to as I found out this week, to really watch what the amount of information that you take in. And I mentioned before, for those that are joining now, Dr. Alfie with the Acoma Project, she talked about how in these times, especially in the past week and a half, we have to really watch the amount of news that we consume. So with that in mind, can you expand a little bit on controlling the noises around us?
Yes, absolutely. So obviously we need to unplug, especially our Black brothers right now. Unplug, stop scrolling, stop consuming. I'm not saying altogether, but take breaks. Take breaks. And even further than that, when I speak of silencing the noise, I'm also speaking of silencing those that are trying to tell you how to feel. Because a lot of times there are those people around us that will try to tell us that we should feel this way, or no, you shouldn't feel that way, or that you should be upset, but only this upset, or you shouldn't be that upset. And we really have to be intentional of identifying those people and walking away from them, and not letting them put us in a box, not letting them dictate how we feel. And expanding upon that, sometimes those people that are putting ourselves in boxes, or putting us in boxes, or telling us how to feel, or telling us how not to feel, sometimes that noise is our own voices in our own heads, right? And a lot of this comes from gender norms that tell men that they can't emote. So sometimes it's men telling themselves that they can't feel a certain way, or that they can.
Guilty.
Yeah.
Guilty.
Sometimes we put ourselves in boxes, right? So when I'm speaking of silencing the noise, I'm speaking of, yes, unplugging, but I'm also speaking of silencing those people that are trying to tell you how you should feel and why. And if those people are you, silencing that noise as well and letting yourself feel vulnerable, letting yourself actually feel those emotions. There's a lot of pain out there. And particular to this conversation, as it relates to Black men, you should feel it and you're allowed to feel it.
Hmm. Perfect. I mean, I don't think I could have said that any better if I tried. And that is a fantastic advice. That is great advice. That is advice that we all should look for. We all should search for, right? And one of the things that I want you to expand on is you have two boys,
Yes.
and as somebody that does not have a child, I cannot understand the fear that comes with that, especially in this world, in this country. What other advice do you give to your boys, or have you given advice to your boys that could also help other men out there, the Black men?
So my boys are 5 years old. I have twin boys. And
Okay.
so at 5, right, thankfully, they're not at the point where they understand what's going on. But day to day, what I have noticed, and this is probably with all children, is that they have tantrums, right? And they're losing it. And it appears as if they're beyond control, or that there's no way to really calm their tempers. But what I've done, especially with one of my sons in particular, is we practice breathing exercises. And it's ironic because what I tell him now is just breathe. And when you think about what's going on right now, it's almost as if I'm telling him, breathe while you still can. But that's the advice that I would give to all Black men and Black women that are watching this or listening to this. Breathe while you still can. Breathing is supposed to be voluntary. I tell people this all the time. It's supposed to be voluntary, something we do without even thinking about it. But it's become involuntary for a lot of us. A lot of us are holding our breath from anxiety, fear, depression, worried about tomorrow. We really have to release, and we really have to learn to press pause, to stop where we are, and literally just breathe in, breathe out, and listen to your breath and just stop. Really be intentional. So with them being 5, that's been really, really beneficial and easy for them. Anyone can do it. Just stop and breathe. I also, and this is not just for, or this is probably beyond my 5-year-olds, but for my boys, my older boys, my teens, my young ladies, my grown men, I tell them to find your outlet. Figure out what that is, right? Is it writing? Is it journaling? That might not be everybody's thing. Is it fitness? Is it music? Is it family? Is it cooking? Find something that is a beautiful distraction that you love. Not just work. Work doesn't count. Work does not count. Find some sort of outlet. And if you do have benefits, if you are in the minority that has access to that type of health care, call the number on your card and look into your counseling services. See what's covered. And I know it's hard because if you are lucky enough, right, as a Black man to find therapists or to have access to therapy, it's really hard, as you mentioned earlier, to find a culturally competent therapist. So there's a second part of that. But if you do have access to therapy, definitely it's not taboo. Definitely seek a therapist out. See if you can find someone that you can just talk to. If you cannot, find someone in your circle that you trust. Find someone that you can just talk to every single day. At some point from the evening on through the end of the day, my boys and I do what's called a rose and a thorn. And literally, I just encourage them to tell me. They begin with a thorn. Tell me something you didn't like about your day. Just talk to me about it. So that's their thorn. And the rose, we end with the rose. Tell me something great about your day, something you love. We can still do that as an adult. We can do that with someone that we trust. So find someone you trust.
Yeah. And that is just help and advice that many of us men out there are looking for. Speaking from experience, speaking from, when I was in trouble and looking for advice and couldn't find it. I wish I had that. I wish I had this before things got worse. But now they're better, which is why I'm doing this. I'm doing this project. But again, those words resonate so well with me And I know for a fact that they're going to resonate really well with a lot of other Black men out there, that are looking to find an outlet, looking to find something to cling on, especially in these days. So with those words being said, I really want to end the conversation here. I thank you so much for taking the time and helping out with this project. I appreciate it. Keep doing what you're doing and keep sharing your passion as well, and your words of wisdom. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.